In the summer of 1888, on a stretch of land in the deep south, the sky had not given up a single drop of rain in 11 weeks. The cotton stood bent and brown in rows that used to ripple like green water in the wind. The creek that once fed the whole valley had shrunk down to a memory of stones. And on the porch of the Whitfield farmhouse, a thin, quiet young woman named Clara Sutton sat mending a torn dress, listening to the men in the yard mutter the same thing they had been muttering for weeks, that she was one more mouth to feed on a farm that could barely feed itself. Nobody meant for her to hear it, but she did. She always did. There was a particular skill she had learned over the years in making yourself small enough that people forgot you were in the room, and a particular ache that came with how easily that skill came to her. The land itself told the story before anyone needed to speak it aloud. Where there should have been 100 acres of green, there was instead a brittle brown carpet that crunched underfoot. The fence posts cast long, harsh shadows across soil so dry it had split into 1,000 puzzle pieces. Even the air felt different, thin and dusty, carrying the smell of scorched earth instead of growing things. Farmers 2 counties over had already given up and sold what little remained of their land. Whispers said the Whitfield place wouldn't be far behind. Clara had come to the Whitfield place 2 years earlier, after her grandmother passed and left her with nothing but a small cedar trunk, a worn cloth pouch of seeds, and nowhere else to go. Her grandmother had raised her from the age of 9, after a fever took both her parents in the space of a single terrible week, and for 10 years that small cabin on the edge of the county had been the only place Clara ever truly felt safe. Her grandmother had been a quiet legend in her own right, a woman other families came to in secret when their own land seemed to be failing them, a woman who never wrote a book or kept a ledger of her knowledge, only a single worn journal and a lifetime of careful observation passed mouth to mouth, season to season. When she died, Clara had nowhere left to go and no one left to claim her, until a distant cousin mentioned her plight to Eli Whitfield, a widower raising 2 children alone. He had taken her in more out of obligation than welcome. One more responsibility on a farm already buckling under its own weight. She cooked, she cleaned, she watched his children, Thomas and little Mary, as if they were her own. And in return, she got a cot in the attic and the quiet, constant feeling that she was tolerated rather than wanted, that she occupied space someone else might have used better. Stay with us, because what this overlooked young woman is about to do to save this entire farm is the kind of thing that gets written into family stories for 100 years. And if you don't want to miss a single moment of how she does it, now is the perfect time to tap that subscribe button, because the storm that's coming for this farm is only the beginning of what she'll have to fight through. The drought had been going on since spring. First, it was an inconvenience. Then, it became a fear. By midsummer, it had become a countdown. Eli Whitfield owed the county bank more than he could ever hope to pay if this year's cotton failed, and the cotton was failing. Every morning he walked the dead rows with his hands behind his back and his jaw clenched so tight it ached by noon. Every night he sat at his desk under a single oil lamp, staring at numbers that refused to add up, no matter how many times he reworked them. He had buried a wife on this land. He was not about to bury the only inheritance he had left to give his children. His children felt it too. 10-year-old Thomas had stopped asking questions about the future. He used to talk about what the farm might look like when he was grown, which fields he'd plant first, how many horses he'd keep in the barn. Now he simply did his chores in silence and watched his father's face for signs of how bad things really were. 7-year-old Mary had taken to hugging her rag doll a little tighter at night, as if she somehow understood, in the way children understand things without being told, that something precious was slipping away from her family. She had started asking Clara almost every evening whether the rain would ever come back. Clara never had an honest answer for her, only a gentle one. And Clara watched all of it from the edges, the way she watched everything. She was used to being overlooked. She had been overlooked her whole life, first by relatives who saw her as a burden after her parents died, and now by farmhands who saw her as an extra plate at a table that already had too many empty ones. And there was one thing those farmhands didn't know about her. One thing nobody on that farm knew. Her grandmother had not just left her a trunk and a handful of seeds. She had left her knowledge, old knowledge, passed down through generations of women who knew how to read land the way other people read books. How to find water that hides beneath the ground, sometimes only feet from the surface, waiting for someone patient enough to look. How to plant a seed so deep and so carefully that it could survive what should have killed it, anchoring its roots far below where the heat could ever reach. How to listen to wind and watch clouds and know, days before anyone else, what kind of weather was coming, whether it carried rain or only more dust. It was knowledge that didn't come from any schoolbook, the kind that gets dismissed by men with diplomas and bank ledgers as superstition, right up until the moment it saves their lives. Clara had never used any of it, not once. Why would she? Nobody asked the quiet girl in the attic for her opinion on anything, let alone on how to save a dying farm. She had carried that knowledge the way she carried everything else, quietly, privately, never quite believing it was something worth offering to a world that had already decided who she was. But late one night, lying awake and listening to the dry wind scrape against the window, she opened that cedar trunk for the first time since her grandmother's funeral. She untied the cloth pouch, and she made a decision that would change everything, not just for her, but for every single person on that land. The next morning, she asked Eli Whitfield for the smallest, most worthless corner of his property, a patch of ground so poor that nobody had bothered to plant it in years. He almost said no. He almost laughed her off the porch. But something in her voice, a quiet certainty he hadn't heard from her before, made him pause. He gave her the plot, mostly because it cost him nothing to lose it. What happened next, the farmhands didn't believe at first. They watched this slight, soft-spoken young woman kneel in the dirt at dawn, pressing seeds far deeper into the ground than anyone planted seeds, packing them with handfuls of dried herbs and crushed bark. They shook their heads. They called it foolishness. They called it a waste of good seed. If you think watching a skeptical farm crew mock a quiet girl with a trowel is dramatic, just wait until you see what happens when those very same seeds break through ground that everything else on this farm couldn't survive. And trust me, you'll want to be subscribed before that moment hits, because it changes the whole direction of this story. Days passed, then a week, and on a morning that started no differently than any other, 10-year-old Thomas wandered out toward that forgotten corner of the farm and stopped dead in his tracks. There, pushing up through soil that should have been lifeless, were tiny green shoots, not one or two. Dozens of them, standing defiantly in a sea of cracked brown earth. He ran. He ran so fast he nearly fell twice crossing the yard, shouting for his father, for anyone to come and see. And when Eli Whitfield walked out to that plot and saw it with his own eyes, green life where there should have been nothing, something shifted in him. The doubt didn't disappear all at once, but it cracked. And through that crack, something like hope began to seep in. He found Clara that same afternoon, standing quietly at the edge of her little plot, as if she'd known all along this moment would come. He asked her plainly whether what she had done could be done on a larger scale, across the whole farm, before the bank's deadline arrived and took everything they had left. Clara's answer was simple. It was possible. But it would take every hand on the farm working together, and it would take trust. Trust that a girl nobody had ever taken seriously actually knew what she was doing. That night, in the lantern-lit barn, Eli Whitfield did something none of his farmhands expected. He told them that from this day forward, they would follow Clara's lead in the fields. There were doubtful looks. There were murmurs from men who had spent their whole lives working this land and weren't eager to take instruction from a girl half their age who had spent the last 2 years scrubbing pots. But there was also Eli's voice, steady and certain, cutting through the doubt. We will follow her. And whether out of respect for him or simple desperation, the farmhands agreed. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, dozens of weathered hands knelt in the dirt beside Clara, learning to plant the way her grandmother had taught her, deep, deliberate, patient. Clara walked the rows, showing each man and woman exactly how far down to press a seed, exactly how to pack the soil with a mixture of dried herbs and crushed bark that helped the ground hold what little moisture it had. It was slow, back-breaking work under a relentless sun, the kind of work that left blisters on soft hands and dust caked into every crease of skin. Thomas, once skeptical, now carried baskets of seed mixture from row to row with something close to pride on his face. Mary, too young to plant, took it upon herself to water a single seedling each day from a small tin cup, treating the task with the seriousness of a sacred duty. But for the first time in months, the farm had something it had been missing, a plan and a reason to believe in it. In the evenings, exhausted farmhands rested against hay bales in the barn, passing a shared ladle of water between them, and for the first time, some of them spoke Clara's name not with doubt, but with something close to respect. Of course, the drought did not simply surrender because one young woman had a plan. Just weeks into the new planting, the sky on the western horizon turned a strange, bruised yellow-brown, and within the hour, a dust storm rolled across the valley like a living wall of brown fury, swallowing the horizon whole. Clara barely had time to herd the children indoors before it hit, the windows rattling, the whole house groaning under the force of it, fine dust finding its way through every crack in the wood. Outside, the wind tore at everything that stood, fence posts, scarecrows, and the young seedlings that represented weeks of careful, hopeful work. Inside, the family huddled near the hearth while the storm screamed against the walls for what felt like hours. Mary buried her face in Clara's shoulder. Thomas sat rigid and silent, old enough now to understand exactly what was being lost outside, but too young to do anything about it. Eli stood at the window, watching helplessly, his reflection ghost-like against the swirling brown chaos beyond the glass, his mind already calculating how much further behind this single storm had just set them. When it finally passed, and the family stepped outside into the eerie stillness of its aftermath, the damage looked devastating. Settled dust coated everything in a thin grey film, and many of the young plants lay bent or snapped entirely. But as Clara walked the rows the next morning, crouching beside plant after plant, she began to notice something remarkable. The seedlings planted deep, the way her grandmother had taught her, had survived where shallow-rooted plants had not. Bent, battered, dusted grey from root to leaf, but alive, their deep anchors having held firm against a wind that had flattened everything planted the ordinary way. She spent the following days mixing fresh batches of her grandmother's herb and bark remedy, packing it gently around every damaged stem, splinting the worst of the bent stalks with small slivers of wood, the way Thomas, now genuinely invested, helped her tie into place. It was painstaking work, plant by plant, row by row, but within a week the difference was undeniable. More than half the crop stood firm again, greener and somehow sturdier than before, as though the storm itself had tested them and they had passed. It is moments like this, watching everything a character has worked for nearly get torn apart by forces completely outside her control, that remind us why we keep coming back to stories like this one. If that's you right now, go ahead and hit subscribe, because the next part of Clara's journey, the part where she goes looking for water hidden beneath the earth itself, is honestly one of the most satisfying things you'll watch all week. With the surviving crop as proof that her methods worked, and the farmhands now openly grateful rather than doubtful, Clara turned her attention to the farm's deeper problem: water. The well was running dry, sinking lower with each passing day, and no amount of clever planting could save a farm with nothing left to drink, nothing left to irrigate, with once the rains failed to come at all. So she returned to her grandmother's journal late into the night, candle burning low, searching for the oldest trick of all, using a forked willow branch to find water hidden beneath the ground. A method passed down so many generations that nobody remembered exactly where it began, only that it worked more often than it failed. She cut a forked branch from a dying willow near the dry creek bed, testing its balance in her hands the way her grandmother once showed her as a child, half playing, half teaching. She explained the plan to Eli on the porch one evening, watching his face carefully for the doubt she expected. It came briefly, but it didn't stay. He had learned by now not to underestimate her. The next morning, Eli watched her walk the dry meadow at the edge of the property, with that branch held loose in her outstretched hands, half expecting nothing to happen. The grass crunched dry beneath her boots. The sun climbed higher, and still nothing. And then, near a strange cluster of weeds that had somehow stayed green through the entire drought, weeds Clara had noticed weeks earlier without quite knowing why they mattered. The branch dipped sharply in her hands, almost pulling itself downward. She marked the spot with a wooden stake, her heart pounding harder than she let on. The men arrived with shovels within the hour, and the digging began under a harsh midday sun, dust flying with every strike. Hour after hour, the pit grew deeper, the soil at the bottom growing visibly darker, damper, cooler to the touch. Clara knelt at the edge, holding her breath without realizing it. And just as the afternoon sun began to lean toward evening, a shovel struck dark, damp earth, and then water. Real, cool, life-giving water, rising up from a hidden spring that had been waiting beneath that farm the entire time, patient and unseen, exactly where an old piece of forgotten knowledge said it would be. Thomas and Mary splashed their hands in the small pool at the bottom of that pit, laughing in a way the farm hadn't heard in months, the sound carrying clear across the yard. Eli knelt in the dirt beside it, stunned into silence, running his fingers through water he had genuinely believed, just hours earlier, did not exist anywhere on his land. And Clara, quiet, overlooked Clara, stood at the edge of it all, holding her grandmother's pouch against her chest, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she belonged somewhere after all. That evening, word of the discovery spread through the farm like wildfire, and an impromptu celebration broke out in the barn. Simple food, shared laughter, farmhands who had once whispered about her now openly thanking her, one by one, for what she had done. Eli stood before the gathered crew and thanked her formally, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't bother hiding anymore. What followed were weeks of hard, hopeful work. A well house built by hand. Irrigation channels dug from that spring out toward the largest fields, and slowly, field by field, the farm that had been dying in front of everyone's eyes began to turn green again. Neighboring farmers, hearing whispers of what was happening on Whitfield land, came to see it for themselves, standing on the porch in disbelief at rows of thriving cotton surrounded on every side by farms still choking on dust. Eli, for the first time since Clara had arrived 2 years earlier, introduced her not as the girl who helped around the house, but as the woman whose knowledge had saved his entire farm. And something in Clara, something that had been folded up small and quiet for years, began, finally, to open. But saving the farm from the drought was only half the battle. The bank still held the final word, and the deadline Eli had been dreading for months was finally upon them. When the county banker arrived for his scheduled inspection, expecting to find the same dying farm he'd seen on his last visit, he stepped down from his wagon and stood in stunned silence at the sight of healthy green fields stretching to the horizon, rows of cotton heavy with bolls where he had last seen nothing but brown ruin. He removed his hat, as if the sight demanded some kind of respect, and walked the rows himself in disbelieving silence, running his hand over heavy cotton bolls and crouching once to examine the dark, healthy soil beneath thriving vegetable rows. Eli walked him through it all, explaining the irrigation system, the new well, the deep planting method, with Clara following a respectful step behind, answering the banker's pointed questions about her methods with a calm confidence that would have been unthinkable for her just months earlier. By the time the banker sat down at Eli's table to review the updated ledger and the season's yield projections, his decision had practically made itself. He signed an extension without much further discussion, shook Eli's hand, and climbed back into his wagon, leaving a trail of dust behind him down the long dirt road. Eli and Clara exchanged a relieved, joyful glance the moment the wagon disappeared from sight, and from the porch, Thomas and Mary erupted into cheers, jumping and hugging each other in pure, unfiltered relief. The farm, Eli's farm, his children's home, the only home Clara had left in the entire world, was safe, truly and finally safe, for the first time in nearly a year. Was the kind the whole valley remembered for years. Long tables set under lantern light, heavy with food that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Fresh vegetables, golden cornbread, pies made from fruit nobody thought would grow this year. Music drifted across the yard from a borrowed fiddle. Clara danced with Thomas and Mary, while Eli watched her from across the gathering with an expression that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with something deeper, something he hadn't let himself feel in a very long time, not since he'd buried his wife and quietly decided that part of his life was simply over. But that very night, alone in her attic room, long after the lanterns had burned low and the farm had gone quiet, Clara did something that surprised even her. She began to pack her trunk. The farm was saved. The bank was satisfied. Her work, as she saw it, was done. And some quiet, wounded part of her, the part that had spent her whole life believing she was only ever a burden waiting to be moved along before she wore out her welcome, told her it was time to go before anyone had to ask her to. She folded her grandmother's journal carefully into the trunk, telling herself this was simply what was right, that a farm this size didn't need an extra mouth once the crisis had passed, that families like the Whitfields eventually settled back into their own rhythm without room left over for someone who had only ever been a temporary fix. It was Mary who found her first, padding up the attic stairs in her nightgown for a glass of water and stopping cold at the sight of that half-packed trunk in the candlelight. Her small face crumbled instantly, and she ran to Clara, clutching her hand so tightly it nearly hurt, begging her, in the broken half-sentences of a frightened 7-year-old, not to leave, not now, not ever. The commotion brought Eli to the doorway, and what he saw there, his daughter in tears, Clara frozen with a folded dress in her hands, the trunk gaping open between them, told him everything he needed to know. He stepped into the room and said the words he had clearly been holding back for far longer than even he had realized. He told her, plainly and without hesitation, that she had never once been a burden on this farm, not for a single day. She was the reason it still stood. She was the reason his children still laughed in the evenings, instead of going quietly to bed afraid. She was, in every way that mattered to him now, already home, and he was asking her, not as a hired hand, not out of obligation, but as someone who had come to genuinely need her in his life, to stay. Clara's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for 2 long years, tears that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with finally, for the first time since her grandmother passed, being told in plain words that she was wanted. The whole family gathered around her in that small attic room, arms around each other, the candlelight glowing soft and warm over a moment none of them would ever forget. If a moment like that doesn't make you want to stick around to see how this family's story actually ends, I don't know what will. So if you haven't already, this is exactly the moment to subscribe, because what comes next is the kind of ending that makes the whole journey worth it. Clara stayed. Not as a hired hand tucked away in an attic, but as part of the family she had quietly, steadily saved. In the months that followed, the farm flourished beyond anything the valley had seen in years. The well that had once stood nearly dry now fed irrigation channels reaching every corner of the property, and neighboring families, hearing what had happened on Whitfield land, began adopting her grandmother's old methods of deep planting and careful water reading on their own struggling fields. A small schoolhouse eventually rose on the property, simple but sturdy, where Clara herself taught local children how to read land the way her grandmother had taught her, how to listen to wind, how to trust soil, how to find water hidden in places nobody thought to look. Knowledge that had nearly been lost with one woman's passing was instead spreading outward across an entire valley, carried forward by the very girl everyone had once dismissed as extra weight on a struggling farm. Thomas grew taller and steadier with each passing season, helping maintain the irrigation system he had once watched with folded arms and open skepticism. He had a way with the land now, an instinct Clara had quietly nurtured in him without either of them quite noticing it happen. Mary planted her own small garden beside the house, copying every careful motion she had learned from the woman who had once been nothing more than a quiet shadow in their home, and who was now, in every way a child could mean it, simply family. By the following harvest, on that same porch where farmhands had once whispered that Clara was just another mouth to feed, Eli took her hand in the warm light of a setting sun. There were no grand speeches needed between them anymore, only a quiet certainty that had been built, brick by brick, season by season, out of dust and water, and seeds planted deeper than anyone believed possible. It was clear, without many words at all, that she was never going anywhere again. At the edge of that very first plot, the small, worthless corner of land where it all began, somebody placed a simple wooden marker. It read only 3 words, where it began. Eli stood before it many evenings after that, remembering the woman everyone once dismissed as just another mouth to feed, and the farm, the family, the entire future she had carried, quite literally, out of the dust with nothing but her grandmother's pouch and a knowledge nobody else had bothered to ask her about. This is the story of a young woman the world had taught to make herself small, who carried inside her the one thing that could save an entire farm, an entire family, an entire valley. Not strength of muscle, not money, not status, but knowledge, patience, and a quiet kind of courage that nobody ever bothered to notice until it was too late to ignore. It is easy, in a story like this, to focus only on the drought, the storm, the well, the bank, the obstacles that came one after another like waves against a shore. But the real heart of it was always Clara herself, and the simple, devastating truth that she had been capable of all of this the entire time. Every single day she spent quietly scrubbing pots and minding children, while men twice her age muttered about what a burden she was. The land didn't change. The drought didn't care who was overlooked and who wasn't. What changed was that one farm eventually gave a quiet young woman the chance to be exactly who she had always been, and that chance was the only thing standing between ruin and survival. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. How many Claras are out there right now, in every town, on every farm, in every family, carrying knowledge or talent or quiet strength that nobody has thought to ask about? How many people get written off as extra weight simply because they don't announce themselves loudly enough? Clara never asked for credit. She never demanded to be heard. She simply waited for the moment her grandmother's wisdom was needed, and when that moment came, she didn't hesitate. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us to put together, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button before you go, because we have so many more stories like Clara's waiting for you. Stories about the people everyone underestimates, right up until the moment they prove the whole world wrong. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next one.